Hello, my name is Tia, also known as Costumed Fiend because I'm both evil and excessively fond of dressing up. As Disney continues on with its next annoying live action remake that no one really asked for, and yet some people still watch anyway, I was reflecting on whether or not live action fairy tales or live actions of animated characters ever work, and I think the short answer is yes, I actually do. My problem with Disney is that I, one, respect animation, two, love some of the original films, and three, the company itself has more money than God, so there's really no excuse except corporate greed that they're all mid at best. I'm not here today to continue hating on Disney though, although that might happen a little bit more, but I'm gonna move on because I want to get into what actually does work. Starting with cartoons and live action, there are actually a few that I think did it right, but I'll just narrow it down to the Flintstones, the early 2000s Scooby Doo movies, and The Grinch. The Grinch in part because I recently rewatched it, as I mentioned in my other video. First and foremost, I think the big reason they all work, and what is always a strong foundation, is the cast. For the Scooby Doo movies, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't at least think the cast was well done. I believe they even specifically wanted a real couple to play Fred and Daphne, and they chose Sarah Michelle Gellar and Freddie Prinze Jr., who turned out to be perfect because one, Sarah Michelle Gellar brought a kick ass side to Daphne out while still managing to be girly, much like her work on Buffy, which probably is also inspired why she was picked. And I think Freddie Prinze Jr. nailed the himbo thing and has some decent comedy chops. Linda Cardellini was pretty much the perfect geeky foil to Sarah Michelle Gellar. And she's no stranger to playing a geeky type of person. And Matthew Lillard did Casey Kasem's Shaggy voice justice. Good enough to the point where I believe he's actually voiced the character on a few more recent animated projects since the original voice actor passed in 2014. When it comes to the Flintstones, John Goodman always plays a good patriarch, and Rick Moranis plays goofy but lovable very well. Admittedly, Rosie O'Donnell was an interesting choice for Betty Revel, but I think even that managed to work when combined with everything else. And the movie also boasts having Cheryl Lee Ralph and Halle Berry, so you cannot beat that with a club. As for the Grinch, I mean, in real life, Jim Carrey is a bit wacky, I'll just say, but that is admittedly what makes him perfect for most of the stuff he's in, but specifically the Grinch, because it's a part that requires that level of energy, especially since Jim Carrey's wearing a lot of makeup, prosthetics, and costume for the role. This pretty much brings me to the next part of the winning formula, making everyone look the part. I think the early 2000s X-Men movies can sort of be blamed a little bit for why a lot of live action stuff, specifically superhero stuff, has kind of been watered down in order to appear more grounded. When you think of the X-Men costumes in the cartoons and the comics, they're much more colorful, and they pretty much went with black for everyone in the films. Like I said, a good cast can be a strong foundation, but with characters in comics and cartoons, the fact that they have distinct color palettes is kind of what makes them stand out and what makes them stand the test of time, especially since more often than not, too, in animation, they're wearing the same clothes all the time. So it kind of like feels weird, I guess, to move too far away from that. And too, in the case of the Grinch, he doesn't wear anything, but they have a distinct shape and color. The Scooby Doo gang also, too, specifically have a specific color palette, and due to their creation being from the 60s, the live action was able to blend those things, I think, with the early 2000s and make them all very recognizable to fans who would have found Scooby Doo at any time. Similarly, the Flintstone movies pretty much lifted the looks directly from the cartoon. So yeah, next, when you combine the good cast with wearing iconic looks, when you add then some great set design, you kind of have a formula that can make up for any flaws that the story might have. Although, quick side tangent, I feel like all of the stories too work really well. Deciding to make the focus of the story on the Grinch and Cindy Lou Who's relationship, for example, was a good choice emotionally. I think it made it hit good. But yeah, back to set design. The opening to the first Scooby-Doo live action captured the energy, I think, of the final wrap-up on a classic episode, and the decision to contain the rest of the story to an island with a creepy amusement park was pretty much the perfect choice. Both Scooby-Doo and the Flintstones did use some CGI, I think, but there were still plenty of grounded effects to balance things out, so regardless of whether or not the technology aged well, I still find them both rewatchable. The set on The Grinch, on the other hand, feels very much like a snow globe, and one implication of the opening and ending is that they exist on or in a snowflake. It's very self contained and it doesn't try to go too big with its locations, which works perfectly for what was originally a simple children's book. The final ingredient, which I think transitions nicely into me bringing up the live action fairy tales that I think are worth watching, is that there should be an obvious love or appreciation for the source material. If fear of sincerity or being too cheesy absolutely gets in the way of making a good adaptation of an animation. On the flip side, it's also necessary, though, to take the material seriously. In the case of fairy tales, for example, these are some of the oldest stories we have, and a lot of people go into adaptations with the sole intention of fixing them. Instead, they just end up creating lifeless slop. There are ways, I think, to make a story updated for the current times that I don't think, require you to take a shit on the original. Or again, in the case of fairy tales, since there aren't really set originals, there are ways to make the basic structure fit for a modern audience. Keeping in mind, too, that a modern audience isn't a fixed set of people because modern isn't a fixed place and time. When I talked about Beauty and the Beast, I already brought up the live actions that had my attention, although I will bring up the 2014 French version, which isn't my favorite, but the costumes are definitely amazing. So if you do like costumes, it's worth it, I think, for that alone at least once. And that is also largely what make movies like Mirror Mirror worth watching to me. It's not a perfect Snow White adaptation, but they did actually cast little people to fill the role of the dwarves and actually gave them dimension in a way that no other Snow White adaptation ever really has. They gave them jobs and they made it clear that the only reason they were like thieves living in the woods was because of discrimination from the evil queen. So by the end of the movie, they each, went back to doing what they did before, and one of them even has a love interest. It's a small part, but still, one of the think one of the criticisms, I think, of the original fairy tale about the dwarves is that they're treated kind of like just this magical fantasy species, and it's clear that none of them are ever really supposed to be a potential love match for Snow White, and that can be a lot a bit degrading. So I think that Mirror Mirror actually did seem to try to do something interesting. And also going off a tangent about costumes. When I think of live action fairy tales with the best costumes, it's pretty much Mirror Mirror, the 2014 Beauty and the Beast, and that 70s Donkey Skin movie that kind of take the cake for me as far as European inspired stuff goes. I feel like those movies are also kind of why I'm very hard on Disney, because there's no way in hell you could even be a little bit impressed with their Party City Ready costumes once you've watched those films. The costumes in the Brandy Cinderella, which is another one of my favorite live action fairy tales, feel like a kind of nice balance of whimsical, but since they're a made for TV movie, they had a fraction of the budget, so it kind of blended those things. They're a bit cheesy, but in a way I think that really works. And Ever After's costumes are kind of more grounded in reality, which is my other favorite live action Cinderella. They all work well, though, and in my opinion, good fairy tale movie costumes shouldn't look like you could buy them in a store. I think there's a time and place for simplicity in media for children, so that young kids can feel like they could one day achieve the same results. But I'd also argue magic and whimsy that feels a bit unobtainable can leave a lasting impression and give young people something to strive for. Also, not all fairy tale movies have to be for children, and that's what can help make them stand the test of time. The movie Tale of Tales, for example, was rated R, and it also, in my opinion, did a lot of things right. Between the costumes and the switching off between three different stories, it manages to capture the magic of fairy tales and the lessons of fairy tales while making them something that didn't talk down to its audience. Anyway, those are just some of the ones I like, but there are a few live action fairy tale movies I'd like to get around to that I haven't yet, so I can't really speak on them. But overall, I'd say the best ones tend to be some of the older ones as far as fantasy goes. There's some movies that I'd put in a separate category and consider to be modern day adaptations of fairy tales in the sense that they take place in at the time they were made anyway, the present. Like, for example, how Splash and Aquamarine are basically The Little Mermaid. But I feel like I want to talk about those separately since they're kind of achieving different things, and the point of this was to make the comparison to Disney's current movies, which aren't trying to have a modern aesthetic or anything, or a modern setting. So yeah, when it comes to live adaptations of animated pieces of media or of fairy tales, there are all sorts of expectations that people will have. Ultimately, I'm of the mind that most cartoons are cartoons for a reason, and that animation is the perfect medium for fairy tales because of the, looser limitations with regards to things like magic and dragons and transformations and all sorts of like fairy tale creatures. In order to make live action work, there kind of needs to be a balance struck between grounding the story in reality while still maintaining the magic and essence of the original piece of work. If you use too much CGI, for example, you may as well have just animated it. And if you ground things too much, you lose the charm, and that kind of makes the characters or stories, feel flat and kind of ruins what made them appealing in the first place. At the end of the day, as long as we're primarily motivated by profit, there's really no way to make live action adaptations of anything good, since profit driven projects don't tend to take risks and are made with merchandising in mind. That's honestly the reason I feel the need to talk about this stuff in the first place, because as much as I enjoy being a hater, I do think it's important to highlight what can be learned from pieces of media that do things well. And with the new year coming up, I honestly, as I mentioned before, usually end up feeling crap. So I kind of wanted to try ending more on how we can do better. Um, so yeah, are there any things that you think make live adaptations good or that set them apart? If so, I'd be curious to know what they are. In the meantime, I mentioned it in my description, but I do have a Kofi page. There's absolutely no pressure to tip me or anything, but if you like this or any of my other videos, I wouldn't object to that kind of thing. Times are hard though, so I kind of get it either way. And yeah, in the coming year, I'm definitely going to try to again stick back to a Sunday at 7 schedule. I'll leave some flexibility for mental health stuff, but otherwise, I think I've gotten kind of the hang of how I wanted to approach this stuff. But yeah, other than that, leave a like if you liked, subscribe for more nerdy rambling, and as always, have a good one.